So today we're going to be doing a CodingBat problem called array2 matchUp. And given arrays nums1 and nums2 of the same length, for each and every element in nums1, we want to consider the corresponding element in nums2. And so we want to return the count of the number of times that the two elements differ by 2 or less, but are not in fact equal. So I want to open up Paint to actually show you what that means. So we have num1 and we have num2. Now, we have this understanding that we have elements, and elements are inside these boxes, right? And then, of course, we also have these indexes, right? And we can have these elements in an array. We know that the default value is 0, but if we were to suppose that that they have default values, not default values, but let's suppose that their values are populated with particular numbers. So this one could be 8, this would be 2, this one could be 6. So essentially, we want to look at the corresponding elements. So if we're looking at nums, nums1 of let's say 1, we would essentially be looking at this element. But if we look at nums1 of 1, then we also want to look at nums1 of 1 for this for nums2. So we'd also want to be looking at nums2 of 1 at the same time that we're looking at nums1 of 1. And we want to essentially take these corresponding numbers in the array and we want to subtract them because we want to find if their difference is less than or equal to 2. So we would take this and we would take this, okay? We would subtract them and we would then arrive at a value, and this is 4, okay? And because this is not less than or equal to 2, we're going to have a count variable, right? Because this is not less than or equal to 2, we're not going to add 1 to our count variable. But if at all that occurs, if we do have two numbers which give us a subtraction of 2 or 1 or less than 2, then we want to increment our count variable and we'll add 1 to it. And we essentially want to do this for each and every single element in the array. And we really just want to know if the difference is less than or equal to 2. And you'll notice one problem here is that we could have two numbers let's say like here we have on the first one we would have 4 and we would have 8, and then minusing 4 minus 8 we get a negative number, and we just want their difference, which would of course be 4 but without the negative sign. So I mean, we would either have to, in our code, we would either have to somehow we would have to avoid that, and I'll talk about two different measures we can take to avoid that. So I'm going to open up IntelliJ here so that we can work through the actual code. So in order to actually replicate the CodingBat problem, I'll actually have to take two arrays, let's say int nums1, and that will be equal to, let's say 1, 2, and 3. And we would also have to have another int nums2, which would be equal to, and this is exactly off the site, so that these values are the first test case, this first example. So first things first, we definitely want to reference, well, we definitely want to search through the array, and we're going to do this for such that I is less than nums1.length. Since nums1.length is similar to nums2.length, we really don't have to worry. We can just iterate for that many times because, of course, both of them consist of the same length. Now, usually what we would do is we would say, okay, well, the difference, and I'm gonna introduce a variable here called difference. It's going to be int difference is equal to 0, and the difference will essentially be nums1 of I minus nums2, or sorry, nums1 of I minus nums2 of I. So that would essentially, so each time the for loop would execute on each iteration, we would essentially be adding 1 to I, and that would allow us to reference the indexes of both arrays in unison, in a sense that they're synchronized with each other, because if I increments, then it increments for both, thus it references both indexes on both arrays, the same index, that is. But we want to take into account if one number is greater than the other, or well, we want to take into account we could have negative values. So if nums1 of I is greater than nums2 of I, then our difference is essentially going to be nums1 minus nums2. And of course, if nums1 of I is less than nums2 of I, then our difference will equal nums2 of I minus nums1 of I. So whichever number is bigger is we're going to put that first in the subtraction problem. But mind you that we don't just want to subtract the bigger number from the smaller number from the bigger number. We actually also want to increment count a variable called count by 1, if at all subtracting them is valid. So int count is equal to 0. So if in fact the difference is less than or equal to 2, then we will increment count by 1. And it would essentially be the same thing here. If in fact the difference is less than or equal to 2, then we'll increment count by 1 again. So at the end of this for loop, count has a very definitive value. And of course, it incremented if the difference between both numbers was less than or equal to 1, or sorry, equal to 2. But what you'll notice is that the question also says that we can only do this process if both elements are not equal to each other. So we're going to add this in our if statement. We're going to say, okay, if the difference is less than or equal to 2 and nums of I does not equal to, well, nums1 of I does not equal to nums2 of I, then is this valid? And we'd add the same constraint for this one. So let's go ahead and take our code and actually see if we get a positive outcome on CodingBat. So we actually have to return count, and you'll see that we get all greens. Now, was this essentially the wisest solution to take? Probably not. And I say this because there are two other solutions that we can sort of refer to or use as an alternative. And you'll see that our entire process here was trying to discern between whether one number was greater than the other, because we only wanted the difference despite the sign of the number. So if it was negative, we don't want a negative. We actually just want the difference between those numbers. So what we could have done is we could have just used the math.absolute_value function, which is actually built into CodingBat. So we wouldn't have to, plan out two scenarios if one or the other numbers are negative. So what we can do, and I'm just taking most of this away so that I can revisit so that I can explore a different solution. So essentially what we will do is we'll say, okay, well, the difference of both numbers, we know that it's equal to nums1 of I minus nums2 of I. And we want the absolute value of this particular computation. And that would give us the absolute value. And then we can just say, okay, well, if the difference is greater than or equal to 2, and the difference does not equal to 0. Now, I say does not equal to 0 because if both of those numbers are equal to each other, then that would imply that we would get 0. And so if I'm just going to say that the difference does not equal to 0, which would technically just mean that they weren't equal to each other, because if they were equal to each other and they subtracted from one another, then we would get 0. So that's a good way to say that the difference is to say that both elements are not equal to 0. So if the difference is actually less than or equal to 2, and the difference is not equal to 0, then we'll actually just increment count by 1. And after it's all said and done, we'll just return count. And you'll see that this gives us a positive answer as well. And it's not as lengthy as the code we had before. Now, another thing that I want to sort of share is, could have we just done something like this, where we stored the difference first, and then we took the math.absolute value of difference, and then compare difference to those conditions? Well, you'd see that we actually don't get correct answers. And we get some of them correct, but some of them aren't. And that's because we're actually not storing math.absolute value into a variable. We're just, in this line, it's just giving us the absolute value for the difference, but it's not storing the difference in difference itself. Whereas before, you'll see that difference was, in fact, storing the absolute value of both numbers. Now, another thing to ask is there like another way to do this that we can optimize our code further? Well, there probably is. So what we can do is we can say if math.absolute value of nums1 of I minus nums2 of I, right? And this is getting a little tricky because we have to take into account the parentheses. So if nums1 of I minus nums2 of I is essentially equal, is greater than or less than or equal to 2, and not, and we would essentially have to use the same thing again, right? Is not equal to 0. We can return true. Or actually, we would have to increment count by 1, now that I think about it. Yeah. And this also works perfectly fine. So we've definitely optimized our code much, much further so that it's not as long. This is not that long. So yeah, 3 solutions to matchup.